that mic. Right.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Tim Hunt. I'm the CEO at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and I am so excited about this panel. I've been thinking about this panel for 6 months. I kid you not. Yeah, and I know we've got a bunch of diehards in the audience here that are all excited to talk about ethics as well and hear a discussion. We've got a great panel. In a moment, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. The topic is the importance of ethics in cell and gene therapy. Devin Smith, our chairman, alluded to this earlier this morning in his introductory remarks. I touched on it briefly. I do think that if you step back a little bit, I've been in the biotech industry for about 25 years, and I am a big proponent. There's a lot of great things that we have been able to accomplish in biotechnology. I think there's millions of patients that are alive today. Their lives have been improved because of the work of the field, including many people that are in this room, obviously. At the same time, I think we've made some mistakes along the way. I think our industry has gotten its reputation battered around a little bit, and there's probably some fair criticism in that, and maybe some unfair criticism. Okay, that's fine. I think it's important that we admit when we make mistakes on things. And so one of the pet projects I talked about with our board of directors going back many months ago was, I think we need to talk more about ethics. We're in the business of permanently altering people's DNA. This is not a trivial undertaking, and as I said this morning, and I've said kind of a number of public occasions, you know, for too many of our patients, millions of people around the world, the status quo represents death or serious disability, right? No one runs out and takes a gene therapy or a gene editing regimen or a cell therapy because they're feeling great and they're in perfect health, right? The patients are in difficult shape. So I think it's important for us to get together every now and then and to convene and ventilate some of what I call the small e ethical topics, right? And they include things like drug pricing and access and global access and a lot of other things. So we've got a very good, diverse panel today. I'm going to start by turning it over to Ben to introduce himself, and then for each of the panelists, I want to just have it as an introductory question. You know, what does ethics mean to you within cell and gene therapy? So, Ben.
You want me to answer that while I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so Tim, thank you very much for having me and for convening this panel. My name is Ben Hurlbut. I'm a faculty member in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. I study basically ethics and governance in the biosciences and biomedicine in the mode of sort of historian, sociologist, and bioethicist, wanting to understand the approaches to ethics, not merely say what, you know, should or shouldn't be done. And I guess sort of for my general comments around the importance of and the role of ethics in this domain, I have a few just sort of very general comments. Number one is that ethics is about doing good, right? And this is a field that is poised to do great good in domains where, you know, human beings have basically been incapable of responding to human needs. And yet it requires thinking deliberately and carefully about what doing good means, because benefits in the short term can be harms in the long term. I think some of the things we'll talk about are in that mode. The other thing I want to say is that ethics is often thought about as in terms of prohibition, but I think that that's wrong. Ethics is actually primarily about innovation, and limits themselves can be sources of creativity and innovation. Third, this is a domain where lives are at stake, and it makes this industry a different kind of industry than other industries, because the stakes associated with the work and how the work is done and what the work means and in the name of what public goods the work is undertaken has a significance that, you know, in the automobile industry or the smartphone industry or the whatever are simply not present. And therefore, ethics, first and foremost, requires engaging, and I would admonish this community to take this seriously, requires engaging in challenging conversations, not hiding from them, not putting them off, not shunning them, but embracing them, engaging in them, even where there is the possibility that they will put out into public space and possibly even engender controversy around things that are difficult for this community to contend with.
Great, thank you, Ben. Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Lambert. I'm the previous CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine and now a consultant at the Densmore Group. Thanks, Tim, for including me in the panel. I'm also a member of the No Takers Club, apparently. I guess when I think about the question about what do I find sort of the most interesting about the ethics of cell and gene therapy, I'm most drawn to the issues that I think are really unique to cell and gene therapy. I mean, there are a lot of ethical issues that come with being a producer of life-saving medicines. And some of those are uniform across lots of kinds of medicines. But I think there are some things about gene therapy and gene editing in particular that are, kind of top of mind when I think about ethical challenges. And the first one, I think, is for gene therapy, the fact that it's one time, at least in the current world of immunogenicity in which we're operating. And I think that presents some really special challenges, clinical challenges, and challenges for parents in many cases. And I mentioned to Tim that one of the most kind of profound things that I heard, or one of the most profound conversations I had in my time at ARM, was from a mom who had signed her child up for a safety study. And even though this was a very well-educated mom, she was just felt profound guilt about having done that, and that her child was therefore ineligible to get a therapeutic dose, which in that particular case turned out to be different than the safety trial dose. So I think that's very unique to this space and calls for kind of some new kinds of thinking about consent in particular. And the other thing is, I think gene editing allows us to prevent disease in ourselves and our children, and that presents a lot of ethical challenges, just that one sentence, because there's an issue about what is a disease, is what's worth preventing, what needs to be prevented. And then, of course, the whole host of issues around kind of germline and making changes that will affect not just yourself, but your children and others. And if we have time, we can come back around to that. But to me, those are kind of the top of mind ethical issues for me for cell and gene therapy.
Great, thanks, Janet. Rob?
Yes, Tim, thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to Tim for inviting me. Thank you to the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for being here at a panel on ethics. We ought to give all of you a sticker that says, I care about ethics, right? And for everybody who's out there who doesn't have a sticker, you can give them the side eye at the reception this evening. So I'm Rob Perez. I'm an operating partner at General Atlantic. We're a global growth equity firm. I'm also the founder and chairman of a couple of different nonprofit organizations. One of them is called Life Science Cares. Life Science Cares is kind of the life science community's way of impacting poverty in the major biopharma hubs in the US. And if your company is not involved in Life Science Cares, they should be. So please ping me and make sure that we get you guys involved, because it is a way for us to impact those who aren't living the same lives as we are. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of it in the cities in which we operate. I'm also the founder of an organization called Biopharma Leaders of Color, which is a group designed to try to amplify and help access for people of color within the industry as well. So, Tim, you asked what does ethics mean to me? I think, as you know from our many years working together, I'm not a very smart person. And ethics is kind of defined by a set of kind of moral principles that helps you to navigate very difficult and challenging problems and situations. And I think as a former CEO, as a founder, there are many, many times where having an ethical compass really does help to make the complex simple. And I think that's the way I would think about ethics for this panel and ethics for this industry, is we are dealing with, as you've all suggested, extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily challenging issues. And if we can have more conversations and come to more alignment on what an ethical kind of code or ethical standards could be for the industry, it can help to be kind of a North Star on how we want to operate and how we want to make those very difficult decisions. And for me, that's always been a really important part of how I can deal with the most challenging questions, the most challenging decisions, the most challenging kind of complexities in operating a business. So that's what it means to me.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. Always worth listening to Rob Perez. Tay, please.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Tim, for setting up this, I think, very timely session on ethics as we start approaching prevalent pools of patients in cell and gene therapies. I'm Salimullah, and I have been in the healthcare space for a couple of decades. Very fortunate to be part of the first team that led the first FDA-approved cell therapy, Kymriah, and most recently our AAV technology for spinal muscular atrophy. In my lane of value, access, pricing, health economics, we have a very simple compass, to steal your analogy, that we look to build individuals, associates, leaders who, regardless whether they work in the function or in the broader business, around how do we democratize access to gene therapies. And there's a real polarity in that because, most recently, having had a development opportunity to interview with the New York Times, the punchline was, how can you have $1 million, $2 million gene therapy and leave babies to die? And so we had to very carefully and thoughtfully navigate such a topic with a very, I would say, high readership journalistic. But that theme of democratizing access is really on how you, A, find the right people who have the ability to reinvent a playbook. The function is set up in a way where we exist to manage ambiguity and uncertainty, where people are really finding a new playbook for cell and gene therapies. And really the underpinning, I would say, the DNA of the folks. We didn't go to gene therapy school or academy, certainly myself, and the people we've hired and built their careers in cell and gene therapy, but it's underpinned specifically by a self-imposed responsibility that looking for ways to find new opportunities where patients around the world get access, not only in the United States, but in Europe, but other environments, which we'll talk about more in the panel. So thanks, Tim, for setting this up.
Great. Thank you, Tay. Durhane.
Well, first of all, I'd like to echo thanks to Tim for setting up this panel. I had never really imagined that ARM would actually have a panel on ethics, so I'm truly delighted that not only that you're having it, but to be a part of it. First of all, Durhane Wong-Rieger. I am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, which is our National Alliance for Rare Diseases. And I also serve as Chair for Rare Diseases International, which is our global alliance for patient organizations. So in that respect, we actually try to look out for patients right across the globe, including many, as you would imagine, in many, many more depressed areas, low middle income countries. So when you talk about ethics, it becomes really challenging. And quite frankly, with all due respect to both Rob and Tay, I would say you cannot evolve ethics to a set of principles, to a set of guidelines, even to a set of best axioms, because at the end of the day, one can always find two ethical principles that oppose each other. Do the most good for the most people, or leave no one behind. Take care of those who are the most in need, or put the resources to where you know you're going to get the likelihood of the best outcome. I mean, they're almost opposed in some respects. So just having ethical principles is probably not going to get us out of that dilemma. I think I had some conversations about, what is a vision of, really getting gene therapy to, quote, everybody. And what we know is that not even everybody in the most developed and in the wealthiest and in the best, set up health systems are going to get access. So what does that really mean when we talk about trying to actually, kind of take an ethical approach? For me, at the end of the day, maybe not surprising, ethics is highly personal. And at the end of the day, it's also personal to the person that you're really trying to help engage in terms of what is the right decision. For me, it's always helping people to understand kind of what the scenario is, but helping them at the end of the day to get to the best decision for them personally. So we can't always do what is ethical. We can't even always do what is good. In fact, you know, that whole notion of do no harm is sometimes our best ethical principle. And in this whole arena of cell and gene therapy, if you ask me what is an ethical solution, I would have to say I have no friggin' idea. I absolutely don't know, right? And I think it's because we really don't have any rules for this. As we're all saying, this is the most amazing breakthrough in terms of therapies. Truly life-saving therapies. And how many patient groups do I work with that say, all we want to do is find a cure? Guess what? We're finding cures. The problem is we can't give them to everybody. Or even if we want to give them to everybody, not everybody wants to take them. So that's also an issue. Do you give somebody a life-saving therapy if they don't really want to take it? And do you fault them because they don't want to take it? I don't know. But what about the people who really want it, who, you know, I was just recently at a meeting with a number of our international scientific conference, and we were having a session for patients on cell and gene therapies. And I asked one of the patient groups next to me, she heads up a patient group that's in Africa, in Zimbabwe. I said, Trudy, you're going to go to the session. She says, I'm not going to go to any more gene therapy sessions. I'm not going to go and hear about therapies that we will never get. I absolutely refuse to go to any more. And she said it. I mean, she's one of the smartest, most involved patient advocates I know. And I had to kind of take a step back and say, of course, it's true. It's just, I just don't want to know about them anymore. I don't want to tell anybody about them. So what's the ethical thing to do there? I don't know. I wish we could, in fact, have a solution that would serve everybody. But unfortunately for us in this whole space, right, how do we get to doing what is, quote, the right thing? I don't know. You know, I guess it goes back to how do we help people to actually be able to come to the best decision that's possible. But even then, that doesn't help us all. So I wish ethics would help us out of this, and I hope that we do evolve a set of ethics that will allow us to be able to get there.
Yeah, great. Thank you all very much. And Durhane, thank you. You get extra points for being a little spicy and disagreeing with Rob and Tay. I noticed that. Nice job. We're expecting a certain amount of respectful disagreement on this panel. We talked about that in advance, so you're leading us off nicely. So why don't we, Ben, maybe I'll go to you on the next question, and then maybe back to you, Durhane, because I'd like to get the kind of quote-unquote outsider's perspective outside of the, you know, the direct industry people on pricing and sustainability of the system, right? So I talked in my opening remarks about, hey, look, you know, these are, if you're talking gene therapies, these are $1.5 million to $2 million to up to $3, a little bit north of $3 million a pop, right? That raises a few eyebrows, understandably. And questions, I think legitimate questions come up around, you know, is this sustainable? Can these health systems, whether in the US or Europe or around the world, can they actually afford all of these things? And I talked a little bit about some of the data that our friends at Mark Trusheim and the guys at the team at Tufts Newdigs have put together that I think is helpful context. So I kind of put my thumb on the scale this morning, but this is not about me. This panel is about other people's views. So Ben, why don't we, you know, let you speak to that in general, and how do you see this as, one of the things we talked about is this the system working, but it's a different model and the current system's being stretched, or do we need a whole new model because the system is really broken and can't sustain these? So any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not a health economist, so I don't understand the system. Second of all, I'm not in the business, so I'm not going to make any money from the system, right? But I think that if the system is taken for granted, and everybody is acting within the system in the particular ways that they can act within those constraints, the system is broken. In the sense that there's a kind of paradigm shift happening in this domain, right? Beginning to unfold. And the question is whether the way of doing innovation in health for the public good is suited to the kind of innovation that is happening in this domain. Because if it isn't, then that's not good innovation, because it's not going to serve people as well as it could. And I think it's incumbent upon this sector, all the different stakeholders engaged with the sector, to ask pretty hard questions about whether the way, you know, business as usual is playing out is the best way for that business to play out. And if things change, some businesses may get broken, right? But that's, I think, sort of the way things should go if the question is about the broader purpose of this domain, which is to heal people, to treat people, right? So I think that it's too easy. The pricing, I mean, the sticker shock is just profound, right? And it's too easy to say these prices are bad. This must be a bad industry, right? But there's a lot that's baked into this. And so I don't have an answer to that question at all. But it does seem to me that there has to be a recognition that that regime is unsustainable in the long run if the promise of this field plays out, right? Not over 5 years or 10 years, but 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. It's unsustainable, which is to say society is arranged in such a way that it cannot benefit from the good things that its investments have produced. And that is a bad thing. That is a failure. So it's unsustainable in that sense. But no less importantly, the ways of asking questions about whether it's sustainable or not and the ways of justifying it themselves have ethical stakes. So is the right way to think about what a life that may follow a path of neurodegeneration to death over the course of its first 8 or 9 years, is the right way to ask questions about that life in terms of healthcare costs saved, future economic productivity, blah, 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 to count the various different beans and pile them up and say, look, there's value here. I mean, maybe that's the way that one has to convince some set of actors, some set of technocrats in a given moment. But maybe that's the wrong way to ask questions about children's lives, right? And so I think that the ways that we sort of thoughtlessly, maybe out of necessity in a given moment, slide ourselves into certain patterns of reasoning, certain patterns of argument and negotiation, a system gets put in place that no singular actor is responsible for putting in place, but the kind of collective actions of the community put in place. And that system may be bad, not only because of its outcomes, but because of the failures of responsibility, the failures of compassion, of a more fulsome recognition of what's at stake here, get baked into that system. So it's a thing that I worry about. I'm not sure, I don't have an alternative, but it seems to me something that there should be a lot of conversation about in this community, especially right now, because the groundwork is getting laid for these things that will be hard to backtrack on once that infrastructure is built.
Okay. Durhane, thanks, Ben.
That's a hard answer to follow, Ben. And I can't say anything close to being that profound, but as a patient, I have 2 children, both born with rare diseases. One who does have, in fact, a truly undiagnosed rare genetic condition. And if there were a therapy, would I want to get it? Would I move mountain to get it? And the answer is that when she was a child, yes. Now she's an adult. And in fact, she didn't even care to get her genome sequenced because she says, what's the point? She's doing great. So I think, it comes down to being very personal, right? Interesting, when we in the U.S. brought in the Orphan Drug Act, right? The whole idea was to provide incentives so companies would actually invest in drugs and develop drugs for which there was no, it says it clearly, no reasonable expectation that you could make it profitable. And of course, they are highly profitable. And not that they shouldn't be, And is $1 million, $2 million too much to pay for a therapy that can actually, as you say, change a DNA and, for all intents and purposes, cure what in many cases are very severe progressive conditions? If I had $2 million and it were my child, I would probably do it. We had a father that recently raised $5 million to have an N-of-1 therapy produced for his child. So yeah, you would move heaven and earth to do that, right? But we can't expect every parent to do that. I think where the failure came, if I think about the Orphan Drug Act, is that the failure was to not actually set up investment for access. What if we actually had a bucket of monies that we could actually say, okay, here's your investment to develop the therapies. Now here's your investment to bring the therapies to people. Because the challenge isn't that it isn't cost effective. The challenge isn't that you don't make, the money back, right? We all know that, and we all believe it. That's what's so frustrating. Even parents know that. The problem is that we don't have that bucket of monies. So we actually really just need an investment fund, a starter fund. I mean, in Canada, we actually just had the government announce $1.5 billion for a rare disease drug strategy. And I've been pushing to say, I don't want that money invested to buy drugs. I want that money to be invested as a starter fund so that when the drugs come in, we can start it. And when health plans come to me and say, I don't have the money, I say, well, that's fine, we got the monies. We start it. If it works, we continue to pay for it. If it doesn't work, we stop paying for it. And maybe the companies can also take a risk on that. And then as the monies are actually, deemed to be beneficial, we can pay it back and back into the fund. So to me, it's the failures in how we're financing this. It's not the failure in terms of the drugs aren't effective, that the drugs aren't worth the amount that they're being charged. I don't know how much they're worth. So I like Ben, I have no stake in any of these companies, and whatever much money they make makes no difference. But I would not actually say that it isn't worth it. I remember when we had the first recombinant products for hemophiliacs. I was president of the Hemophilia Society at the time. We had just come out of the worst, tainted blood issues. Recombinant products came in, and we made the proposal, can you get us the recombinant products? And the government came back and said, no, they're too expensive. I said, how can they be too expensive? 90% of severe hemophiliacs are infected with HIV. Most of them have C. They're dying, and we don't know what the risks are in return of blood. How can you say they're too expensive? And we actually went through a long economic case to actually demonstrate that, in fact, they're not too expensive, and the companies chipped in. So, yeah, it's an order of scale somewhat differently, but the change is not different. And now, of course, some 30, 40 years later, we know absolutely recombinant products are absolutely cost-effective. They were absolutely the right way to go. And I will say is that 20 years from now, we will all look back and say, why were we fighting about making gene therapies available to everybody? The most exciting thing I heard this morning at the open plenary is that we're going to have gene therapies for everybody. They're not just going to be for rare diseases. And that to me was so exciting because it means that, okay, we're going to find a way of making them so that they're absolutely going to be accessible, affordable to everybody. And the rares are going to benefit from that as much. So, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, it's a failure in our innovation in terms of how do we actually bring them in. It's not so much a failure. And I agree with you. Mark Tresham's New Digs has been the most exciting thing that I've seen in terms of how do we actually bring some of these in. And if we can sell some of those models, we can absolutely get ahead of this.
That's great. Good thoughts. A good plug for Mark Trusheim. I like that. Nice job. They do great work. Yes.
Is he here somewhere?
Okay, Janet, Rob, and Tay. Anybody want a piece of this action? How does that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's like a privilege to talk about pricing, right? Because it means you have a thing,
right,
that you've priced, right? And I mean, I think, many of us have been with lots of patients who they're not worried about the price. They're worried about, is there something that's available for my loved one? So I think I just ask us to keep that in mind. I think also it's useful to keep in mind it's just very early days. This morning we're counting the number of therapies we've got, on now 2 hands, hopefully by the end of the year. And I think the system, I think we all know, having lived in it, there are plenty of problems with the American healthcare system, but I don't think we really know yet whether the system cannot cope with cell and gene therapy. I think what we know is that there is not enough, at least gene therapies, for the system to have adapted to it. And payers will tell you that. We're still limping along, I think, pretty significantly in a one-off kind of system that's brutal for everybody. And I guess I'm optimistic that when we get to kind of critical mass of therapies so that it makes sense for payers and the public and private payers to adapt, that we will do so. And I think we'll get there.
One of the things that Ben said, he was kind of talking about a collective approach. It's one of the things I was noodling in thinking about this problem is, especially today where it's mostly a rare disease kind of focus and obviously pricing, the randomness of it. If you're a payer, you have one patient. If you have two, it could really break the bank, et cetera. And it hits, individual payers, obviously families, but it's very rare and very random on where it's going to hit. And the thing that I thought about is the disability system we have in the US. So in disability insurance, we all kind of pay a small amount, right? We all pay into it because there's a randomness that happens to some people, and they have to stop working, and therefore they're provided some small, but some modicum of support in order to survive that terrible event that could happen to any of us. And I wonder if ultimately we'll get to a solution like that, where we all say, look, this could happen to any of us, so what if we all put a little bit in? And what that means, whether it's payers that do that or whether it's individuals, I'm not sure. But I wonder if that will end up being the solution, because what we don't want is to stifle the innovation. And what we do want is, if that randomness falls on us, what we do want is to make sure that the innovation is there for our family. And so I mean, we're not in a great place as a society right now in terms of collective support, but I wonder if that ultimately will be a part of how we get there.
Right. Interesting. Yeah,
So I'm going to pick up on a word Janet used, which is optimistic, and I think we internally use let's tread with cautious optimism. And I think going first in some areas where it's neuromuscular, cell therapy, gene therapy, it can be seen as a blessing and a curse. But I think a couple of things to highlight. The first is to, really, I think, take a deep understanding of the patients you serve, the healthcare caregivers that are associated directly and indirectly with that care. And why is that important in the area of neuromuscular disease? It could mean the difference of somebody, swallowing or talking for the rest of their life, or walking or sitting. So these benefits, we sometimes think about, we're going to get this slam dunk in gene, but for patients and families to have an incremental change of their status quo is frankly, it's understated, right? So somebody having to walk or sit for the rest of their life can be incredible in terms of that benefit. So we take it really seriously. That's the first thing that you got to start with. Before you even define value and economics and all of that, do you actually understand the pathway, the journey, the years, the days, the weeks, the months families have burnt to try and get care? And when you go and get it, it's like a diagnostic odyssey where they can't even actually then find out who's going to treat them in what center. So these are just before you even get into a transaction of, I'm buying a gene therapy. The second thing is around, you mentioned about price. And, for obvious reasons, I'd comment on that from being the head of global value access and pricing. But we have to look at this in so many ways, not only defining value, but what is sustainable. And I think, for me, just seeing thousands of associates, colleagues here today, not only from big pharmaceuticals, but smaller companies, I was on a session earlier looking at the funding and the gateway and the milestones that companies are looking for. And just thinking about, do I go alone? That's an ethical question. Do I go alone and I can solve this and go to Europe and figure this out? Or do I need to partner and leverage the scale of an organization that can get me to places where no cell or gene therapy has ever been before? And I say this with a lot of humility. If we had, the organization we bought in the Midwest, if, we didn't partner and scale this, most likely it would have remained a company that was probably, in the Bay Area or Boston. But now we've managed to sort of scale that to 3,500 patients worldwide, which is pretty huge, and get access, I think in 40 markets, and 51 approvals. And the theme of that cautious optimism comes with, there's going to be times you're going to get it wrong. And we're guided by, 3 C's, which is how do we co-create with a healthcare system that's in the 20th century with a 21st century medicine. And sometimes it almost feels like we're developing some Star Trek kind of technology, in a Flintstone-like movie. And, you just have to keep engaging and picking people up and saying, look, there's an opportunity here to do the right thing. And the second is to converge, with that uncertainty and data maturity. We've just seen it with the DMD decision recently, that data maturity over time. How can you converge a healthcare system? And we say that, in a very broad term, but many heterogeneous systems with one trial that's been taking place that doesn't reflect all the world's populations. And the third is, how do you then cooperate in a way where, we've now built a muscle to take, some, I would say, shared risk and shared reward. And that means, there's an opportunity to think about your life cycle and how your data will mature, and also stand up to say, what is the product going to do in the real world? And, it was pretty unheard of when we first started. We have data now 8 years out, and it was pretty unheard of in the natural history of the disease that we'll be seeing milestones that potentially we hadn't seen in the past. But you take all of that risk up front, and I just think that's the way that some of the model has matured for us as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you all. Tay, I'm gonna stick with you for a second. You touched on our next topic, which is global access, right? And so if you're a small, or I would say even a medium-sized biotech company working in cell and gene therapy, and you look, and you're based in the US, and you look out over to like Europe, you see a lot of complexity, and it's hard. And how are you gonna actually operationalize this stuff? It's hard to operationalize a product and commercialize it in the United States, never mind a complex world like Europe, right? And then to move to things like, okay, wow, now what if we were thinking about Asia, Africa, South America, other parts of the world? It's incredibly complex. And I think, look, big companies get a bad rap. Sometimes that's deserved. I think a lot of times it's unfair, but you just touched on it. The one thing you do have is global scale, and you guys have figured out not only how to operationalize Zolgensma in a lot of markets, I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that, but also you've got a very early stage program that's looking, an allogeneic program for sickle cell disease, right? Where 85% of the world's population is in Africa and Asia, right? So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about more of the model and what's worked with Zolgensma, and then maybe touch on briefly your sickle cell program, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel. Global access.
So Tim, look, we often talk about translational science. I think translational access has to go hand in hand with that. And why do we say sometimes you can move very quickly, phase 1/2 to approval, and you have to make decisions really early on when you start with that deep understanding of the epidemiology and the patient. So for example, we have 1 in 20,000 in the United States. We have a lot of good understanding of now with our newborn screening efforts across the whole of the United States, 90+% states to treat babies in the first 30 days of life. In Canada, we've treated babies in the first 9 days of life. But that epidemiology is so critical in terms of where you're going to go, because that same figure in places like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey can be 1 in 4, 1 in 5,000. In Brazil, 1 in 6,000. So that scale, I mean, we potentially have more SMA babies to be treated in Brazil than the whole of the United States. Mm-hmm. And people sort of think, oh, really? And yeah, it is really like that. So are you developing a therapy, back to the ethics question, for the US because you can potentially go to the open market? Or actually, are you developing a therapy based on the epidemiology, which should then feed into your trials and the way you understand the natural history of the disease? And that is something in real time we've managed and learned through the markets we've navigated. But it's also sometimes a misconception in the US. We've had to go state by state, plan by plan, state payer by state payer, to really get coverage, to get policies in place. And then, the heterogeneous environment in Europe, I kid you not, our teams have been engaged answering, I think, best part 700 questions on a protracted, back and forth. But, they often get a rap, but they moved, NHS England moved before NICE to fund Zolgensma. And again, that was back to not taking advantage of the vulnerability of the system, but, co-creating something that would work for them as well. And in former roles, I would never have imagined within 3 years of an FDA approval in the United States, we would have treated patients in Egypt or in Brazil or places like Korea, Taiwan, India. But it is a really interesting image that stays with me. A couple of years ago, we had our first patient treated in Egypt where our gene therapy was arriving in minus 80 degrees cryopreserved. And it said plus 53 in terms of the temperature out there. And we had never done that before. Like, we had never taken a gene therapy to places like that. And I think that was a wake-up call where we thought, we can actually use the power and scale and the, I would say, muscle of an organization that has regulatory, manufacturing, and producibility. Can you actually produce the same medicine? And Tim, you touched on something which is dear to my heart on sickle cell. I had the good fortune of working on a flagship program with the government of Ghana, which we launched about 4 years ago at the World Economic Forum, and saying, what is the point of developing gene therapies for sickle cell disease? And I know that sounds really controversial, but what is the point if we can't even get hydroxyurea, which is a basic medication developed over 40, 50 years ago to patients in Africa? And our understanding of newborn screening in sickle cell, our understanding of diagnostics, and frankly, how a society views the disease, with a label of HIV, and then when you go and talk to families and caregivers, issues from witchcraft to God knows what else that are recurring. So who's going to think about gene therapy? And our wake-up call was, if you preserve the organs with the basic standard of care and the screening, when gene therapy comes, then you'll actually have, the organs preserved, which really led to then the reference you touched on, which was the in vivo. Our insights showed us that, we can't do this alone. First insight, so we've got a partner, and who better to partner with than the Gates Foundation, who wants to say, how do we reconfigure infrastructure and make sure that if you're going to scale and reach the democratization of access, then we want an in vivo gene therapy that can be available where, there's no systematic blockages. So we're really excited about that, but it's still a long way to go. And I think the next sickle cell therapies that are going to come out will give us another proof point to see what else we can learn. Because in sickle cell, I think it's going to be way beyond one company's effort. It's going to be a public-private partnership model that I think is going to help. Because 80% of it is outside of the United States.
Exactly. Thanks. Who wants to go next? Global access. Don't all leap at the same time. Ben.
I'll say something. Let me just say something a little off color.
Oh boy.
Okay, so there's access. I think, Tay, what you just said is dead on, that one has to think systemically and not merely about, getting the therapy X to population Y where there's some profound economic disjunction. One has to think over a longer time horizon and more creatively. But I would say that agreeing with that, one has to think even more expansively about the ways that disease is a different kind of problem in different kinds of cultures and communities, as you were suggesting, sickle cell and witchcraft, and the ways in which government and governance comes into this picture. If there are, for example, in India, if sickle cell is a problem associated with particular kind of minority populations who are already in effect in persecuted conditions, it's understood as a different sort of problem than maybe it's not necessarily understood in a therapeutic sense, right? And so there's that dimension of things. There's also the ways in which what in a conversation like this we may treat as apples and oranges may come to be seen as apples and apples. Take note that one of the central arguments for the infamous experiment that was undertaken in China a few years ago is that it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper to do it in one cell than to do it in many, right?
This is, Doctor, just to
this is the heritable genome editing interventions. And those arguments persist. I think that this field is developing forms of capacity that can be deployed in many different ways. And if you're narrowly focused on the particular application that your company, your lab, or whatever is developing, you may not be thinking about the ways in which you may be contributing to the development of other applications, which you may not endorse, you may abhor, and yet follow from a logic of a therapeutic orientation that is at the same time linked to, a cost, linked to a price tag. Because the same techniques may be deployed in another way for a much cheaper price, and it may be done in a context that is not one in which the patient is the decision maker and in the driver's seat. It may be, under different sorts of regimes of governance. So it seems to me that the question of access is not just a question of, how do we pay for it? It's a question of how these problems are understood, who defines what kind of problems these problems are, and how the trajectory of innovation and the kind of priorities and agenda setting within the field broadly contribute to or challenge or reject certain sorts of framings of the kinds of problems that these are and the sorts of approaches that those framings would authorize. And it seems to me that has to be a conscious part of what this field undertakes, because this is about treating people, right? It's not about eliminating people. It's not about customizing people. It's about treating patients. And I think that relationship is not given, but it's one that has to be affirmed and serve as a kind of central commitment. And that means informing the kind of innovation agendas that the community takes on, so that you don't say, well, we've cured sickle cell disease. Well, if you can cure sickle cell disease in 3% of the people who have sickle cell disease, you have not cured sickle cell disease.
Okay.
So I'll jump in a bit, not to follow again what Ben says. I don't know why I always try to follow Ben. There's no hope in that, but maybe picking up a bit on what Janet said earlier as well, but the issue of global access, conceptually it makes great sense, right? We should encourage everybody to try to think about having a plan as you're producing and bringing to market your gene therapy. What are you going to do in terms of making it more globally available? But obviously doesn't mean anything really. And we're, within Rare Disease International, we're developing in partnership with a consortium, a model of what could be called compassionate to sustainable access. And the whole idea is that you look at environments where you could actually hope to have sustainable access, not for everything, but for a particular therapy, for a particular disease. And the idea is that partnering with the companies and partnering with some kind of a contribution program. The whole idea, I think, as Tay is saying, you have to help develop the infrastructure, you have to help develop the services that are available there. But for us, what we're looking for are places that already have some things in place, right? Not to go in, but build on what people have. I was recently, in a different program where we were judging innovations, connecting digital technology with rare diseases. And the most fascinating thing I saw, and I was surprised this didn't win because it was my favorite thing, is that they had a cold refrigerator, so a deep cold refrigerator on the back of a bicycle. And using AI and digital technology, we're able to keep that fridge at the exact temperature it required to be as it went and delivered these therapies, right, or drugs. And it was like, okay, you start with where people are. They were already delivering medicines on bicycles, delivering care on bicycles. Now can we take technology and give you a cold storage unit that you can actually use? So that to me is kind of where we want to go. How do we find where there's already capacity, already interest, already ways in which we can partner? And then what can we do to help, starting off with the idea of where can companies and other foundations contribute? But at the end of the day, it's got to be some form of partnership with the payers, the governments, the systems, to say we want to make this sustainable. It's got to be that. So I think there are ways of doing it, not on a grand scale, but maybe just on an individual project by project scale. We haven't done it yet, but we are hoping that we can find some, not pilot projects, but more proof of concepts. And they may look different in every different environment. And for my money, gene therapies are like one of the best things that we could think about. So I think we'll come back to Novartis and come
I
back.
was just going to say, you better take your details and then we can think about how we plot and plan and solve this puzzle.
Exactly. So we're going to leave, and you guys can finish the rest of the course. I got business to do with this time.
All right, great. We've got 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to this last topic. So why don't I'll start on this. Janet, I think maybe I'll pick on you first. This is on diversity, right? So not an area where over the last 40 years, biotech has shined the brightest, I would say. And looking in the mirror, right, not where we've always certainly been perfect within cell and gene therapy. So plenty of opportunities to improve. You, in your tenure as CEO, put two, I think, very notable programs in place. One was the Women's Executive Forum, and the other one was the GROW internship program. Maybe I could start with you, and then Rob, I can maybe pick on you after that, and then open it up to the others. So maybe you could tell us about that, but for everybody else, I'm sort of ask, what does diversity mean to you within cell and gene therapy?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk about that. Just one quick comment about
course.
the previous.
Yeah, you get the mic.
I think maybe, I guess I would just say, I completely believe, right, that being planful about broad access and global reach for these therapies is really important. I think there is going to be, it will require public-private partnerships. But I would just say it's also going to require us to be successful in the United States and Europe. And that is not a given by any means. Particularly in Europe, we've had such trouble successfully commercializing advanced therapies. And it's just my view that that getting it right and getting the economic base that's necessary from the US and Europe for these therapies is, I believe, going to be absolutely essential to succeeding in global reach, and we have a lot of work left to do there, so just a lot of which you're leading. So just a point about that. On the diversity issue, Tim's right. We started something in ARM called the GROW RegenMed internship program, which is specifically focused on trying to find opportunities for Black undergraduate and graduate students in the cell and gene therapy world. That could be in the patient advocacy world, in the academic world, or in industry. It came out of course, our collective experience of the George Floyd's murder and the kind of social reckoning that occurred after that, and we really thought about kind of what we could do and what we should do, and honestly, our colleagues at Bio had done a terrific job of kind of quantifying what the diversity of the biotech community looked like, and it was very, very plain that the percentage of the biotech workforce that was Black is, I can't remember now, 2 or 3%, some tiny number. And so we really wanted to try to see if we could do something lasting by starting a program with the thought of having a class of interns that would get to know each other, would come to the meeting on the Mesa, get to know some of you, that then we'd have another class, and that class would get to know the first class, because part of what we heard as we started to talk to people in the community was that it can be kind of lonely out here, where even where you have Black professionals already in the community, that was just a comment that we heard more than once, that it can be lonely out here, so making connections felt like an important part of the program. So we have just completed the 3rd year of the GROW program. We have about 18 to 20 interns every year. There are many of them floating around, so I really encourage people to find them and talk to them. They're just spectacular, these kids, and many of them, again, they have a lot of opportunity, a lot of these kids, and our hope is to kind of entice them to what's really thrilling about this sector and the people in it, so that they'll feel like this is where they want to plant their professional flag and help us accomplish what we want to accomplish. So, thank you. Yeah, we're super excited about it. I think Rita will talk about them. I don't know if if she'll also present them tomorrow in the opening. But it's really been, I mean, like I said, I'm just repeating myself. The kids are great. I think it's really an opportunity for us as a cell and gene community to make a concrete difference for ourselves and for these kids. And lately, I have to say, the biggest need that we have is actually for more companies to sign up. We have more kids than we can place in companies, or as I said, it's not all companies, patient organizations or academic settings. So if you think this is something your company would be interested in, please go home and talk about it and get in touch with Tim or me or any member of the ARM team, and we'll help kind of make that connection.
And we do have, sorry, shameless plug, we do have a forum tomorrow at 5 o'clock, I believe it is, our Grow Mixer. So if you want to learn more, tomorrow in the ARM ballroom, we'll be talking about the program, sorry.
Oh, good, yeah, so definitely, if you're feeling like you just want a little inspiration at the end of your day, I would encourage you to attend that. It's really spectacular. I mean, look, it's not going to move the needle from 3% to 6%, but it did feel to us like a way we could make a meaningful difference and to create a significant enough community that maybe we could accelerate the growth and the awareness in corners where there hadn't been as much awareness as we would have hoped. So,
yeah, great, thank you. Rob, you've committed a lot of your time, energy, resources to this topic for many years, so maybe you could just share a few thoughts with us. And we've got about 4 minutes left, so we'll do what we can with the rest of the panel.
All right, I'll try to be quick.
No, it's okay.
I speak a lot on diversity panels, and usually it feels like I'm banging my head against the wall. One of the things that I always say, it's one of my favorite sayings when it comes to this topic, the saying is that every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it's producing. So you can want things to change all you'd like. You can want it in your bones for it to be different. But the system is going to work to deliver the results that it's been producing for decades and will continue unless you do something to either break that system, create different systems alongside of it, like what you guys are doing with Grow. That is a terrific example of another system, another process to try to get more young people involved in the organization and in the industry. At Life Science Cares, we have a saying that's called, we believe in caring actively. That means don't just write the check, sign the petition, actually get involved and get our industry involved. We too have an internship program that we call Project On-Ramp, in which we take underserved students, all Pell Grant eligible. So these are all kids living below the poverty line, most of whom are students of color, but not exclusively. And they are given their first paid internship in a life science company. This summer we did 300 students, and we are working our way to 1,000 students a summer, all getting their first chance in a life science company in many, many different functions. And the reason I say that's important, programs like yours, programs like On-Ramp, et cetera, is what we are doing is super hard. It's super hard, right? And guess what? We are never going to get it right. We are never going to get to it if we don't have all the talent that we could possibly attract. And right now, we are not attracting all of the talent. There are young people out there who have extraordinary skills, who unfortunately did not win the parent lottery, and they are in state schools, in community colleges, trying to find their way. And many of them have no idea that this industry even exists. So whether you're involved with Grow, whether you're involved with Project On-Ramp and Life Science Cares, what I would ask you is to care actively, get involved and make a difference, because that difference is not only the right thing to do, it kind of is, but it's not only the right thing to do, it's the best thing for innovation, it's the best thing for patients. It's the reason that we're all in this industry, is to do better by the patients that we serve. And we're going to get there by attracting all of the talent that's out there and can help.
Great. I'm going to unfortunately have to let Rob, I'm going to have to let you have the last word. I'd love to hear from the others, but we are up against the clock, and I know we've got a 5 o'clock start with our next group. So please join me in thanking this this group for this discussion.